Welcome to Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I'm James Shao, and with me, as always, are my co-hosts, Ed Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Hello.
If you're joining us for the first time, we are in the middle of our series, The Novel in Stories, where we examine story cycles or linked collections. This episode, we are reviewing our third and last book, The Tsar of Love and Techno by Anthony Marra. Next week, we will discuss the historical significance of this work, and in week 3, we will talk about writing across cultures. We previously discussed for this series Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad and Ali Smith's There But For The, which you can find in our archives. And if you'd like to join our discussion, you can find a link to our subreddit in the episode description. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. Anthony Marra is a young writer, refreshingly young, because the last two writers we've read were all about 20 years older than him. He was born in 1984 in Washington, D.C., so he was born around the same time we were. It's kind of nice because, you know, a few episodes ago, he had made a comment about us being middle-aged, and it's kind of got me down. But I can say that he's a young writer, and now feel very, uplifted. Because as a 38-year-old, you are a young writer. He's only got 2 books out. In his youth, he spent a few years in Eastern Europe, a formative experience, since his first 2 books, A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, and this book, The Tsar of Love and Techno, are both set in Russia.
It's a Paolo Bacigalupi move. Studied abroad, read a bunch of books, you can trust me.
Yeah. Constellation, his debut novel, won a host of awards. His third book, a novel titled Mercury Pictures Presents, will be published this summer. And it won't be about Russia, so that's nice. A nice change. So this book, The Tsar of Love and Techno, was published in 2015. While his first book was nominated for a lot of awards, this was not. The only nom and win was for Literature.gr's Phrase of the Year award. Phrase of the Year. He won for the Phrase of the Year.
What's Literature.gr?
If you do not go to Literature.gr's Phrase of the Year award page, it's a Greek award. It's actually his second Greek win, so I don't know what the connection is between him and Greece, but yeah. So he won the Phrase of the Year in 2016 for the sentence, "In what prayer does the last human not die alone?" It blows my mind that there is an award. I can't get over this. There's an award for a phrase. What a country. In Greece, you win an award for a phrase. It's like, are they not bothering to read the book? Like, are people, when they submit this, are agents just submitting, like, their client's best sentences? Like, how does that even work?
Well, I mean, everyone else already has Book of the Year and Story of the Year. Why not go for something different?
Yeah, and why, go so far as to have a sentence, right? It's not sentence of the year, it's phrase of the year. You don't want something too long, Is being a judge of that just a lunch? You meet up, you read 10 phrases, and over lunch, you're just like, that's the one.
Greece is famously very careful with how they spend their money, so...
All right, so this book calls itself a collection, though Marra has said in interviews that it could also be seen as a novel, and I think he expressed some regret in not calling it a novel. This was an interview about 5 years after publication. The Tsar of Love and Techno is quite similar to the first book in our series, Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad, in that it takes place over a long period of time. The first story takes place in 1937, and the most recent story takes place in 2013. There's the last story, which is kind of an epilogue. It takes place in an undefined time, but I think it's before 2013. There are a few prominent characters or families around whom these stories revolve. Kolya, a soldier who dies in Chechnya, and his high school fiancée, Galina, and his brother. They are from the Arctic mining town of Kurovsk, which I think is a fictional town.
Yeah, it's fictional.
Another character is Roman Markin, a censor for the USSR, and his extended family, who live in Leningrad or St. Petersburg. And Ruslan Dukrov, a bureaucrat in Chechnya, and his wife. Reminiscent of the Goldfinch, Donna Tartt's novel that we reviewed in our Bad Adaptations series some months ago, there is a painting at the center of this book, Pyotr Zakharov-Chechenets, whose fictional landscape painting of a pasture serves as a setting of great import for these characters.
I think it's interesting that the sequencing of the stories is very deliberate. It feels that he introduces characters in a limited way and they grow into more import later on. And it's very similar to A Visit from the Goon Squad, where characters on the periphery become central characters later on.
This book also reminded me of Michael X. Wong's Further News of Defeat. I actually interviewed Mike. His book won the Penn Bingham. And similar to this book, it takes place over a long period of time, takes place in China, so another former communist country, and it stretches from the past to the future and discusses the changes that happened over a long period of time. So, yeah, quite a few books that we've read come to mind when I was reading this book. I read a comment that you guys made on our Slack chat about whether or not you liked this book. And I think both of you said that you had mixed opinions about this book. Was that right?
Yeah, I mostly liked it. I think Ed was a little more reserved.
I'm more negative in general. Yeah, I had mixed feelings.
Well, both of you, I believe, said mixed. But that's right. I didn't apply the SAM filter and the EAD filter to what mixed could possibly be defined as. So I actually thought, when I read the first story, I thought it was fantastic. Like, I think his writing is excellent as a storyteller. He has excellent prose, and in fact, for maybe the first 2/3 of the book, for maybe the first 6 stories or chapters, you could almost pick any page and you'd come across a paragraph that is fantastically written. Excellent prose, excellent pacing, very funny at points, in kind of a dark humor with ironic humor as well. And I think his focus is definitely on plot. He's a writer where things happen in his books. Things change, people die in his stories. It's not something that happens in a lot of literary fiction. So my impression initially was that he is a very good storyteller who can deliver on a story with good plot. He can deliver a story that can move the reader. And by the time you finish the book, I think you are affected emotionally. Would you guys agree?
Yes.
Except for that final story. That final story kind of cheapens the whole thing.
The final story being the epilogue?
Yes.
Is it because it's an epilogue? Because I read it as an epilogue, and I don't like epilogues.
I don't care that it's an epilogue. I care that it is kind of corny. Like, he is very skilled as a craftsman, and he is very good on the level of plotting and on the sentence level. But his sensibility in that final story, I thought, was kind of weak. It was too saccharine.
If you had stopped with the penultimate story, A Temporary Exhibition, do you think that your feeling about this collection would be much different?
It would have been a better impression, yeah. I think that at some point, a writer can earn enough cred with his reader that he should just stop, and adding anything else is a liability. And by adding what you're calling an epilogue, he lost a lot in my eyes, because he was very impressive in terms of his craft for the first even 80% of the book.
I think it's a very different book without it, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I also would have taken out the epilogue. The epilogue offers a different sort of, I don't even know what to call it.
It's a turn toward the spiritual.
Yeah.
And I should note, it's not actually called an epilogue. I'm calling it an epilogue because I read it as an epilogue. I think it functions as an epilogue, but it's not actually called an epilogue.
Is it just called The End? Is that what you said?
Yeah, it's the way the book is structured. There's side A, which has 4 stories. There's Intermission, which is the titular story, The Tsar of Love and Techno. And then there's side B, which is, again, 4 stories, including the end.
I didn't feel like it added a whole lot for me. It tied up loose ends.
I want to come at this a different way, actually. So before we talk about it then, Marra said in an interview that this could have been published as a novel. Do you agree?
I agree. In fact, I enjoy it much more as a novel. I read it and I didn't consider it as a novel in stories. I thought of it as a nonlinear narrative with multiple perspectives. And because it's so well crafted and it works well together, that wasn't a problem for me. I didn't really ever consider it as a novel in stories, despite the theme that we're working with here.
That's actually quite interesting because for me, I think of the three books we've read, this is the one that is most clearly a collection.
Hmm.
Do you think it's more of a novel than A Visit from the Goon Squad? Or is it just the same?
I think for me, A Visit from the Goon Squad is only interesting when you read it as a novel. This can be separated. Like I thought the first story, The Leopard, was interesting on its own. But I think that it becomes even better as part of a novel. So I think that in one sense, this is better than A Visit from the Goon Squad.
I feel like because of the different objects that move in and out, it makes more sense as a novel. Like if you took out the tourist bureau section, I can see that as a standalone story, but I feel like it makes a lot more sense in connection with everything else around it. I think that's true of most of the other stories,
Yeah, and it's won an award as a standalone story.
which I find interesting. I mean, I liked that story, but I think the first story was probably my favorite of these. And I could see that one as standing alone more than any of the others, really.
Okay, so both of you guys think that this would work quite well as a novel, and in fact, should be considered as a novel because of the way the different chapters work together. If we were to evaluate this as a short story collection, are there stories that work better than others? Like you mentioned, The Leopard. I think The Leopard is a very good story on its own. And like what we talked about before, the end, which I call the epilogue, I think is a terrible story. Like you can't read it as a story at all.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think it stands alone.
I also think that the Grozny Tourist Bureau was also quite good. So that coupled with the Leopard, I think are very strong stories on their own. But I mean, once you have demonstrated that these things all work together and perhaps can read them as a novel and not even think about them being separable, because they are published this way with such a clear sequence, why even consider them as stories after the fact?
I think it's interesting as a curiosity, partly, because where I was going with this is it's actually possible, I think, to say that the best stories are the first stories and the worst stories are the ending stories. Leopard is the first story, in my mind, it's the best, and it kind of decreases in quality as you read along. Part of the reason why I came to that conclusion is when I try to evaluate each chapter individually as a story, I think that it just starts getting worse and worse. I think what you said, Ed, about the ending ruining the novel for you, I can see that as well. But the way I read it was not that way. I read each story separately, partly because I guess it was labeled as stories, so I just sort of read it that way. And by the time I reached the end, my conclusion was that the stories went from better to worse.
I think if you evaluate them as stories standing on their own, then it's perhaps true that it would get worse as things moved on. What I would be curious to know is if he wrote them in a certain sequence, because it seems to me as he was writing, he may have realized, oh, I can integrate these things in a satisfying way. So he would make more of an effort as he continued writing to integrate the stories rather than to have them be on their own, and that would make them worse as individual stories. This, I think, is particularly clear with the end, but also with a temporary exhibition, the penultimate story, because the satisfaction of that, I think, really relies on having understanding of the leopard. If you don't know the leopard and you just read that as an individual story, it's not as interesting.
Yes, but even if you do understand the emotional notes that come from reading the collection as a whole or the novel as a whole, do you think that that is a strong chapter, a temporary exhibition? Because for me, it seems like it is not really a climactic chapter, but it's a chapter that ties up loose ends.
I think that if you have a problem with just tying up loose ends, this is not the book for you, because the reason why people would want to read this book is for the pleasure of seeing loose ends tied up, where you see this thing come back and you're like, oh, that's how it fits together.
It makes me curious about the stories that were published separately, if he changed anything, what he changed, and you were saying before, the order in which he wrote these things, because there are questions that get raised in the first half that don't necessarily need answers, but they get raised, and then they all get answered in the second half.
I think that this book in general, it was a certain kind of book and it was very well done, but I knew what kind of book it was.
And what kind of book was it?
Easy to love or easy to admire, I guess is the way to describe it. Like, Anthony Marra is a writer of considerable skill and he knows what people want and he knows how to give it to them. And that is a valuable and desirable thing in a writer, but it's not a challenging or unexpected thing that he's offering us.
I agree with you, but I would say it differently. I guess what I would say is that he's very good at telling a story that pulls heartstrings and that moves the reader. He's great at language, which is, something that if you're going to be a very literary writer, I think you have to be good at language. It's kind of the minimum of being an artist who works in this form. But this leads me to the main point of discussion here, which is there an overarching theme or idea at play? And I think the way I'm asking it kind of, I think, makes clear that I don't really think there is an overarching theme. I think we could reach for some and talk about what kind of ideas might be at play. But when we talked about there, but for in that review, I said, for me, obviously, this is a book about communication and miscommunication and the stories we tell ourselves. And I said, Goon Squad was obviously about the passage of time and aging. I don't think I leave this book with something like that, with a firm idea that this is what Marra is trying to write about, and this is his worldview, and this is what he is saying about the world.
I get those qualms. I kind of felt that as well, although this is something I'm going to bring up a little bit in one of our next episodes. But I think it's hard for me to put it into a very tight phrase, but
you're not going to win that Phrase of the Year award, Sam.
No. But editing the past or editing maybe the truth seems to be something that moves throughout. But also, what do you owe your family seems to be something that goes throughout. But I kind of feel the same way. You do have to reach for those things.
Those are two straws that I would happily grasp at.
This book is like the second coming of the Goldfinch.
Yes, this is where I was going.
Where
yes, I agree.
It's just plot, and it's very well done plot. But when you look for something more thematic, you come up empty-handed. It gives you a little bit about images in all of these stories. So I was coming up with the idea like images are important. Well, yeah, so what? It doesn't really mean anything. It's like the same kind of criticism that I had with A Visit from the Goon Squad. Time passes when you're not paying attention. Like, yeah, but so what? It's obvious. And if you care about theme and you care about ideas, this might not be the book that you want to read, but I don't think it's important. I think that the plot is tidy enough and entertaining enough that it's enough, you know?
I think it is enough. And I also think that because Marra is a young writer, once again, feeling good about ourselves, I think he could grow into, the third or fourth novel that does have some more coherent worldview that presents something more interesting for readers of literature. Like, I can see it because he's such a good writer, kind of just waiting for the wisdom. That's how I felt when I finished this book. I felt like I was waiting for the wisdom, not like received wisdom, like we need him to preach, but there's something about age and seeing the world and being able to write that on the page that young writers struggle with. Not all young writers, but a lot of young writers struggle with.
But where does that wisdom come from? There are lots of old people in the world who don't have it.
I don't think they're writing novels, though. That's part of being a writer of literature is that you have to have that, like that worldview. It doesn't have to be knowledge or wisdom in the sense that you are like passing on something from an oracle. It's like Morrison, where Morrison has something to say.
What I mean is that I don't think there's anything related to the craft of fiction, which I think he has, that will lead him to having a point of view or an intellectual or artistic point of view to present to a reader. Because there are lots of people who have the craftsmanship who never have that. And then there are lots of older people in the world who aren't craftsmen who also never have it. These two things are just totally disconnected.
So do you think then that it's not something that comes with age? It's just some people have the sensibility and some people don't?
Yeah, I mean, some people have incisive, observant minds and some people don't. And Anthony Marra has right now this skill, and he's a very good craftsman, but that doesn't make me think that he'll ever be necessarily a deep thinker.
So the tagline here is Ian Darris calls Anthony Marra an idiot. That's the I know what you mean. I'm not saying that he will definitely develop it, because a lot of writers don't develop it, right? I'm saying that that's kind of what I'm waiting for, because he is such a good writer that I'm hoping that this will come with it.
James, you mentioned a interview.
The new Ohio Review interview, is that the one?
Yes. In that Ohio, what is it? The Ohio Review?
Nope, the new
Ohio Review.
Don't get it confused with the old one. That one's bullshit.
Early in that interview, he mentions that this book came about as kind of the leftovers, stray thoughts and stories that he was working on when he was working on a constellation of vital phenomena. And I wonder if that has something to do with it. Obviously, he should be giving full attention to this when he's putting this together. But if these are the strays, maybe that book is more thought out. Maybe that book had what we're looking for.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as well. And I was also thinking about the fact that, okay, he's really interested in this subject matter, but maybe it's time for a different subject matter. Because...
Yeah. Well, do you know anything about that third book of his, Mercury Pictures Presents?
It's not related to Eastern Europe, as far as I know. I read a few blurbs about it.
Yeah.
Personally, I think he should go Greek, because they love him over there. So that's the way to go. Yeah.
I think that's why he had two in a row, is just he had strays and he decided, well, I might as well do something with these.
To distill what we're talking about here, I think we're talking about the fact that there's two kinds of literature. There's Toni Morrison literature, which is the goal of our podcast, canonical. Like, we're looking for books for the canon. And there's Anthony Marra, Donna Tartt literature, which is not quite there, because it's missing that, whatever you want to call it, the worldview, overarching idea or theme. It's just missing that kind of thoughtfulness that keeps it from being, Toni Morrison literature. And it kind of sucks, because it sounds like I'm dissing Anthony Marra and Donna Tartt, but I'm not, because I actually really did like his work, and I really did like the Goldfinch, but it's just not there.
Right. I mean, you're not going to teach this.
Yeah, that's right.
As enjoyable as this is, you're not going to teach this.
Yeah. There's just something that keeps this from being the capital L literature that we are looking for, despite it still being a very good read and a very good book that I think a lot of people would enjoy. 4.3 on Goodreads. So his new book is coming out, Mercury Pictures Presents. Interested?
I am. Despite me doubting his intellectual capabilities, I don't doubt his craftsmanship. And I think that anything that he has written, I have confidence will be interesting enough to read.
Yeah, I would be interested as well. I'm leaning slightly toward Iad's statement of you only have so much time to read things, but his prose was so good in this that I would give another book of his a shot.
I lamented in the Allie Smith review that we read the book that is not her best, in my opinion. And I feel the same way here. I think, I don't know for sure, Constellation is probably a better work. I mean, that book won all those awards, and it was praised by Sarah Jessica Parker.
Well, there you have it.
And what's the deal with that? Like, is she a book reviewer? I have to Google this. Like, is she a book reviewer or what? Why on the back of this book it says an absolute masterpiece, Sarah Jessica Parker?
It's a recognizable name, right? It's something that sells copies. There's no reason for her name to be there other than that, right? This is the kind of name that people at the airport see on a cover and go, huh, I know that name.
I mean, it's with Meg Wolitzer, who I don't know. I think she's a writer. I mean, maybe she's a very well-known writer. I don't know who Meg is. Sorry, Meg. And Ann Patchett, who I love. And I don't know who Adam Johnson is. So it just seems like it's just out of place. But I don't know if she's doing like a book club now or something where, like what's her
It
face?
is out of place, but it's not as out of place as Lindsay Lohan would be, right? Like Sarah Jessica Parker has put herself in the public consciousness as a certain part of the celebrity world. And she is considered maybe the thinking man's A-lister or B-lister. I don't know.
I don't know anything about Miss Parker. Is she the thinking man's A-lister?
I think that she tries to be more of the cultured person's celebrity rather than Lindsay Lohan or a Kristen Stewart or something like that.
All right. Well, I think we'll stop here. I honestly had no idea about Sarah Jessica Parker's literary ambitions or tastes. So I think after recording this, I'm just going to Google this and find out if she has a book club or what. Like, why is she being quoted? She must be reviewing books. So I guess she's our competition too.
I don't know.
Sarah, we would love to have you and Matthew on the show. Please join us.
Yeah, if you're good enough to be on the back of this book cover, you must be good enough for our podcast. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were way off base with our review of this book and our assessment of Sarah Jessica Parker's celebrity standing, you can let us know on Reddit. That link is below. We are also on social media at CanonicalPod. You can support us by using our bookshop.org link. That also supports your local bookstore. And if you'd like, you can give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back with an in-depth discussion of this book. If you're interested, you can go ahead and find a copy of this book. It's a good read. 6 thumbs up. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.